Happy Pride Month, everybody! It's time to talk about gay ghost OCs again. Hey guys, it's Al! So, one of the earliest ideas I had to celebrate my indie anime project's 10th birthday was to redraw some old art I made from back when I was still actively working on it, since I've been interested to see if my art has improved between then and now. It seems like a pretty straightforward idea, but things ended up changing a lot as I got closer to bringing this video into reality. If you've been here for a while, then you know that my old computer died on me 4 years ago, and I still haven't recovered all of my old files from it. So there's not a whole lot of digital art I found from my web series heyday that I can redraw. Of course, I drew a lot of traditional art back in that time as well, but since I pretty much exclusively draw on my iPad these days, I thought it wouldn't be a fair comparison to draw something on a tablet that I originally created in my sketchbook, or to draw in my sketchbook again when I've been out of practice for doing so in such a long time. So, my rescue thumbnails for my Stories Gag comic spin-off are here to save the day! You may be thinking,
Oh, the last video you posted was all about you reading pages from your coma, and now you're bringing it back for the second time in a row? Are you running out of ideas or something?
just let me cook! Completing my artwork I created as thumbnails for TC's comic was an idea I've had for a while. As the 4-panel format is the same that I use for my webcomic, this is a thing that happened, and I was curious to apply the skills I gained from my current project to this much older one. My original plan was to redraw maybe 3 of the pages that didn't make it in my dedicated video for the spin-off, since there were a few pages I really wanted to see in my current art style, and each one would be in a different art program, being Procreate, Ibis Paint, and Clip Studio Paint, so I could compare and contrast my workflow between these 3 programs just to make the video more fun. But there was a snag with this plan, since the pages that got skipped in my video were left out for a reason I cannot allow them to be perceived by bambles, and the redundancy of bringing back pages I had already fully featured before felt way too tacky, so I was at a loss for what to do with this idea that I really want to pursue but didn't know how to necessarily. Then I saw a video from Rin Spirit Art where she did a compiled sketch page redrawing photos from a recent 17 concert, and in that moment, I had a much clearer image of how I wanted to approach this idea. This brings us to today's topic, where I'll be taking some panels of my choice from my thumbnails, arranging them into a collage, and turning them into polished artwork for the first time in over 5 years! So, I'm going to be redrawing the primary 12 characters from across the series: Weltraum, Kleinod, Sterbenfrau, Foppen, Kotori, Morgen, Nacht, Ratten, Schutze, Schnee, and Sternenglanz. Originally, I was planning to just draw the first 5, but the more I thought about it, I was on the fence about whether or not I wanted to include the rest of the cast, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized the answer to that question was yes. Is this gonna make my life a living hell as I try to get this video done on time? Yeah, but most of these characters I've never made polished art for, let alone any colored references, and if I don't create those in honor of my erstwhile Fanime's 10th anniversary, then when will I? Plus, when I was doing my countdown leading up to the anniversary, my original plan for that was to actually start on the first day of October and do a speed paint of each of the characters, except for Donner and Schnee. But I ended up running out of time, so I had to limit myself to the primary 5 out of necessity. So, this is my opportunity to get retribution for this goal I had but needed to abandon. Since this is going to be a draw and talk style video, I thought it'd be fun to use this time to discuss other topics rather than only limiting myself to what's on screen, since there's a lot I want to share about my experiences working on this art, both for this current redraw and from when I was still actively working on this comic project, and because there's only so much I can say about the same cast of underdeveloped OCs. Hope that's okay. So yeah, enjoy this more chill video for this anniversary celebration. One thing I noticed is that Weltraum's piece was the first one I began sketching, and I started working on this video on May 1st, a date which, at one point in development for TC's revamp that I'm workshopping at the moment, was actually going to be Weltraum's canonical birthday. I don't know, I just thought that coincidence was kinda cute. Drawing his hair was a special kind of challenge though, not just for the artwork in this video, but for everything I drew for this anniversary so far. When I first settled on his design, I decided to make his bangs asymmetrical, with 3 sections on one side of the part and 2 on the other. Since then, I simplified to just 2 on both sides, but since there was so much extra volume on that part that originally had 3, trying to figure out how to get this updated hairstyle to look balanced was a bit of a struggle. On top of that, feature creep was and still is something I still struggle with in my art, so that just added another layer to this problem that I was having. But for this illustration, I think it turned out good. So something you may notice throughout the video is that the characters will sometimes be wearing different outfits in the original thumbnails, like if I was including sketches from the Christmas or beach episode chapters, or happened to pull something that showed them in their human form, as is the case with Weltraum and Foppen. But I'm choosing not to follow these guidelines and instead draw them in their default outfits no matter what, and that was just for the sake of consistency. I did make an exception in Kotori's case, that she's the only human character included in this set, depending on where you want to assign Schrodinger's Sternenglanz. And even then I veered away from the thumbnails depicting her in her swimsuit just so I could draw her usual pigtails instead of the buns she had for just that one chapter. I'm kicking myself for not mentioning this in my previous video, but I started working on the 4-Koma in early 2016, and I was actually able to get about 130 pages sketched out in the span of about 1 year. But then everything changed and the main story got rebooted, and the shift to Most Towns or Ghost Towns kid and made all of my work on the spin-off obsolete, which was definitely painful because back then I really wanted to bring this project out into the world and prove that I was capable of actually finishing something I started for once in my life. Now, thumbnailing that many pages over the course of approximately 12 months, give or take, is theoretically impressive, but what matters most is how many of those pages I was able to finalize, and from those pages I was only able to complete 4. And as much as I hate to admit it, I can understand how this happened. Back then, I didn't have a workflow that benefited the rate at which I could put out finished art. As I briefly touched upon in my previous video, from the time I first embarked on my digital art journey up until like 6 years later, I did the final liner for all of my artwork just using the curved line tool, which was an extremely tedious process. And even when my brain cells eventually did decide to kiss and learn about tablet drivers, I still hated line art with every bone in my body, and it really prevented me from finishing most of the sketches I started. This is because my first, and at this point only, tablet I was drawing with was a Wacom Bamboo Pen and Touch, which I know there's a multitude of artists more skilled than I am who are able to create complete and beautiful pieces with a non-screen drawing tablet, but I am not one of those people at all. I'm useless without a pen display and need to be able to see my hand at all times while I'm working. In fact, once I first got my iPad and an Apple Pencil setup in 2020 and got used to drawing on a screen for the first time, line art somehow became my favorite part of the art process. I know, right? Here's my logic, okay? You have to spend a lot of time focusing on getting your sketch to look just right, coming up with your original idea, and trying to get it to look nice, searching for references, and keeping your proportions on model. Then when you get to coloring, your mind is on choosing a good palette, figuring out your lighting source, and making sure all of your highlights and shadows are in the right place. But with line art, you don't really have that same kind of pressure. You're just going over your original sketch, so you can just turn off your brain for a bit as you follow the pattern you already made for yourself, without as much looking away from your screen to study the references you save. Are you convinced yet? No? Great. Moving on! But yeah, the line art process is kind of more chill, and I didn't realize that until I found some drawing supplies that really worked for me, so thanks, Tim Cook, I guess. My whole spiel I gave earlier is actually kind of ironic since I ended up not using line art at all for any of this artwork and just directly cleaned up my sketches on the same layer. Mostly because I was running low on time for this video and knew I would be able to get this done a lot faster if I wasn't just tracing over my sketches again. And since I was just cleaning up what I already started for the 4-Koma, they were polished enough at this point for me to be able to get away with that. I just had to work on the line width, then crisping up some areas that got fuzzy when I was nudging them around. I kept waffling on whether or not I would merge my sketch in flat color layers and just clean everything up on the same layer, or if I would only touch up the sketches and leave the flats the same, but I realized very quickly that merging my layers would be way more convenient. It's not a technique I have much experience with, if any, and I was afraid that going this route would make the process too complicated since I would be spending extra time I didn't have trying to get used to how this would work for me, but it was actually pretty relaxing. I need to practice with this style of rendering more often. It ended up making the final artwork seem a lot more soft and fluid. A lot of times when I'm inking normally, I feel like my line art comes out looking too smooth and mechanical, but this technique added a lot of line variation that I really appreciate. It's not entirely one layer art though, because I needed my emotional support blending modes for shading and highlights and to add the pink color holes for mouth outlines, but it's a step in the right direction of testing out new ways of drawing, and it definitely helped the process feel a lot less rote than it can normally be sometimes. Putting aside my struggles to make art with tools that bottleneck my creation process, I didn't know how to use my programs correctly, so I didn't know what they were really capable of because I was still approaching them with a brain trained on making traditional art and didn't have anyone to teach me any better until I happened to stumble upon some information that I didn't know I needed from other artists. Like, I went for an embarrassingly long time without even knowing that Clipping Master layer blending modes even existed, and now I've forgotten what life was like without them. And don't even get me started on Clip Studio Paint's enclosed fill coloring tool or even alpha masks and the liquify tool in general. They're a complete life changer and have spoiled me rotten. When I was actively working on pages for this comic, I would be ping-ponging back and forth between Photoshop CS5 and Manga Studio 5EX. I would draw my thumbnails in Photoshop, use Manga/Clip Studio to do the cleanup sketch, line art, color, shading, backgrounds, text stuff, etc., and then finish the page in Photoshop. To be fair, Photoshop has a lot of features I use that still aren't in Clip Studio Paint at all, like layer styles and text warping. Remember, this was 2016, so that was back when Clip Studio Paint didn't even have the ability to let you rotate your text without rasterizing the layer first. But even though Manga Studio was literally the very first digital art software I ever used back in 2011 when I first started to take art more seriously, getting more comfortable with my different art programs over the years and learning how to use their features would have streamlined my process to the point that jumping between programs like I did for this project would have been completely unnecessary. Now granted, I'm still a very slow artist and my technical skills need some major TLC, but compared to this 4-Coma series where I only got 3% of the total amount of pages done for this project, when working on my current webcomic, this is a thing that happened. I could start a new episode completely from scratch in only one drawing program, either Clip Studio Paint on my desktop or Ibis Paint or Procreate on my iPad, and have it already scheduled and ready to go on Tapas all within the span of a few hours. So if I knew 8 years ago what I did about making digital art now, I definitely would have completed a lot more than just 4 pages of the Kid Jonah World spin-off project back then, without being so intimidated by the process that I switched to doing all black and white screen tone pages midway through. Obviously, this is a thing that happened as drawn in a much simpler art style, and that helped me in getting episodes done so quickly, but that's a can of worms to be opened later on in the video, so stay tuned. Actually, now that I think about it, my choice to do the book in black and white may have been financially motivated more than anything else, because the final volume was going to be 16 chapters long. Each chapter would consist of about 20 pages, so we would be looking at a book that was 340 pages long at a lower bound. Back then I was going to use Blurb as my POD service to print the comic, so if I selected their standard color printing option rather than the economy option that I was afraid would butcher my artwork, and went with the smallest trade paperback size they offer, which is a 5x8 inch format, a single paperback volume would have rang up, at the very least, to $57 and 55 cents, with any additional pages adding another 16 cents to the total, not including taxes and shipping. Ugh, the stupid project was too ambitious for its own good. What was I thinking? But wait, there's more. If you thought my drawing process was hindered enough by my inability to get along with my hardware and software, one of the biggest issues I had was a bad habit that affected all of the art I tried to make, regardless of whether it was digital or traditional, which was that I didn't know how to make sketches. Now that sounds really stupid, but it was a genuine problem I had for years, where I struggled with my order of operations and would basically pencil in my line art very tightly and cleanly as my first step, because my smooth square brain could only handle starting right from the outline that would be visible in my final piece without any kind of planning ahead of time, until finally I figured out how to do looser sketches with actual guidelines. And with that, Weltraum is done! Maybe I'm biased, but I think his piece is my favorite of the entire set. But we should probably reserve that judgment for after we see the rest of the characters, which means it's time to start drawing Kleinod. So I'm just gonna say that I really don't like how Kleinod's collage turned out. I was thinking of having one large image in the center and a bunch of smaller ones surrounding it, but once I actually put it together, it just looks really unbalanced and weird. I didn't hate it enough to want to change it completely, but I think this layout in particular is probably my least favorite of all 12 pieces I did for this video. Fortunately, it was around the time that I started putting Sterbenfrau together that putting together a consistent collage started to click for me, although I wasn't able to keep all the layouts to a consistent level of quality, and I'm trying not to let it bother me too much. Trying! Wait, is he seriously the only character that I didn't draw a profile view at all for this series of artwork? Dang. Originally, I was going to sketch each character in order, and obviously it'll look that way for you because each piece is its own canvas that Procreate is recording this speed paint for, which has been compiled into the finished video. But for the sake of my sanity, I allowed myself to jump back and forth from character to character, just so I wouldn't die from boredom and not be completely paralyzed if there was one part of a character's collage that was giving me problems and I needed to move on to something else. When it came to the actual rendering after slapping down the base colors, I did go in order just so I could upload them to social media more efficiently, but there was one outlier, which we'll talk about when we get to that part of the speed paint. Ooh, sneaky mystery. When choosing what I would redraw, I tried as much as I could to avoid repeating art I had shown in my previous video, but this wasn't a set in stone rule or anything, and I mostly just went by what I thought would look good in the composition, and what poses or expressions I thought best embodied the characters. Basically, I gravitated towards sketches that otherwise would have never seen the light of day, sketches I really liked that I wanted to try and improve on in my final new version, and sketches that I absolutely hated that I hoped to fix so I would actually like them. That being said, it got progressively harder not to recycle artists. I continued down my list of characters. I very easily could have gotten away with having Kleinod's piece be made entirely of art that hadn't been publicly shown before, but I thought that one sketch of him in the top left corner from the chapter was really cute and I wanted to bring it back here. I was able to get away with not tweaking the duration of Weltraum's time-lapse at all since the intro was long enough to fill all that time, but once I got to editing Kleinod's portion of the video, the dangerous tug-of-war ensued over how long and fast each little section of the speed paint needs to be, and nothing here is at a consistent speed. I'll just say that the commentary I've recorded was too short, and my voice doesn't need any more help being more obnoxious than it already is, without me resorting to just saying a bunch of crap without actually talking just to use up the empty space. So if I kept monkeying around with the duration of basically every clip down to the most granular details, some parts on the original Procreate speed would shift into maximum overdrive, while parts I sped up before that needed to be slowed back down were like, I lose my speed is gone, how do I get speed? So now we're moving on to the base colors, in which I immediately regret starting with such a dark color to fill in the sketches. It's kind of surfing Ted Theodore Logan right now as I'm carving in the rest of Kleinod's palette, which is not excellent. One experience I wasn't expecting to have as I was finishing these old sketches for the first time was realizing just how much my goals for what I wanted my art to look like and be have changed between now and back when I was originally working on the Cage Underworld's fanime. When I was still planning on having all the pages be in full color, I wanted the artwork to look the same as what I wanted for the episodes of the actual main web series, and back then I had set a very high bar for myself to have immaculately detailed and pretty animation against super glossy fancy backgrounds. If you're familiar with any anime from Kyoani or Makoto Shinkai, then you probably have a good idea of what I was aiming for with what I wanted my art to look like for this project. It wasn't even limited to the Cage Underworld, but for my other series and my art as a whole, my dream was to be able to consistently put out highly detailed and rendered pieces with swoopy and delicate flowy lines and soft and colorful shading, which I think you can see applied in my own artwork and how this has evolved over time when I was able to create something more polished than my usual cel-shaded style of rendering. I still really love this style of anime art, and it still gives me something to strive for with the kind of quality I want to draw, but I think leaning as heavily as I did in that direction during Teenage Me's art journey was holding me back more than it was helping me because I was ignoring some of my instincts. Because I was pursuing art that was unremittingly pretty, I wasn't allowing myself to focus as much on practicing more exaggerated styles, which I think deep down was ultimately what I naturally wanted my own art style to look like. Throughout my life, I've always gravitated towards art styles that were super cartoony and exaggerated, and I tried to incorporate that in my own work, but I felt like I couldn't do that because I was actively pursuing drawing this other, more beautiful and detailed style. And I didn't know how to reconcile these two styles that I felt like were completely opposites to each other. I guess a small part of why I wanted to emulate the more detailed art so much was for the sake of impressing anyone who looked at it by replicating the same level of eye candy as artists I admired, but nowadays I'm slowly trying to find a middle ground between these two styles, and I think I'm happier this way, rather than just going in completely one direction over the other. It's like, you know those posts you see on Instagram where people will ask their followers what their art tastes like? I think deep down, with that in mind, my art has a flavor profile that's more similar to Studio Triggers than Kyoani's, and I'm slowly but surely learning how to come to terms with that. Because who says super stylized cartoony art can't also be combined with detailed anime art and rendering? I think that's a big reason why artists like Peach Pit, Rui Komatsuzuki, Take, Osamu Tezuka, and even just the anime art from the early 90s and prior have inspired me so much personally, because I think they all strike a really good balance of being able to produce such beautiful looking characters while also not being afraid to include other characters in the ensemble that look really out there or emote in ways that are kind of ugly, all the while never losing the sense that these characters all belong in the same world and were drawn by the same artist. Now, I do have a lot of comic ideas, and ideally I want to pursue a different art direction for each one so they can have their own visual identities, but for my default anime art style, this is exactly the feeling I want it to have. Even though I don't practice animation as much as I should, in my mind's eye, the same idea still applies of how much my priorities over what kind of style I want to pursue are changing since I first entered the fanime community. Again, for The Caged Underworld, Kyoani was my role model for how I wanted the series to look, just to prove that I had it in me to create episodes in such high fidelity, I guess, but the older I've gotten, the more I've come to believe that a more bouncy, snappy, and quote-unquote choppy animation style just somehow feels like a better fit for me. So that was a lot. It's weird how this video had the ability to bring back this one super specific memory and then all these emotions I have associated with just come flooding in. On the flip side, I was prepared going into this redraw challenge to find a balance between improving on my original sketches and retaining the essence of what was already there. I own a few comics in my collection that later on went to be completely redrawn from the ground up, and I'd find after reading the updated version and compared them to the original, although the artist's technical skill had definitely improved, there was such emotion and an overall dynamic quality to the art as a whole, not just how the characters were drawn in the original that just wasn't there in the new release. Like, taken as a whole, the new version would still look good when allowed to stand by itself, but stacked up against what had come before, it felt so much more stiff. I didn't want to follow that same pattern with these redraws and made a conscious effort to not lose any emotion as I was redrawing these sketches, which ended up being a little tricky because I didn't want to absorb too much of my old art style and bad habits in the process. I think I whiffed a little on Kleinod's spread since his face shape is supposed to be more narrow, but other than that, I think this task I set for myself was a success. Yay! After all that rambling, I finished Kleinod! Or as my friend at the time insisted on calling him, Kleenex. On that note, let's move over to his arch nemesis, which of course would be Sterbenfrau. And yes, I thought her name was super awkward and cringy even when I first came up with it, but I was too lazy to come up with something better. This wasn't something that happened super often, but when the Caged Underworld's fandom was most active, Sterbenfrau had a tendency to be mischaracterized. Generally, people thought she was more lighthearted and a mischievous trickster, or that she was just a petty boss and Foppen was the real evil one. I'm not entirely sure how this happened, but I'm pretty sure it was my fault. Since I'm already blaming myself for Sterbenfrau's inconsistencies, apparently whenever I drew her back when the fanime was still in active development, I couldn't keep her on model to save my life. The beauty mark on her cheek would change size, gold elements on her costume design would gain or lose details or even just disappear altogether. Her hair fringe didn't have a defined shape, and sometimes my hand would go out to lunch and inexplicably draw her with a completely different hairstyle. It definitely made drawing her multiple times for this piece unnecessarily difficult compared to the other characters, just even more ironic considering her character design is the most simple and bare of the entire cast. She never stood a chance, did she? I'm almost scared to bring this up since it'll probably be taken the wrong way, but it's become more and more obvious to me over time that there aren't really that many female characters in the Caged Underworld's cast, and the ones there are kind of flat without as many defining personality traits compared to the males. which is kind of ironic considering Sailor Moon was the inspiration for this story. What's even weirder was that this was exactly the opposite of the stories I would come up with as a kid. I have a folder containing Word documents of novellas and short stories that I would write chapters for back when I was in elementary school, of which I found 21 stories. In those 21 stories, 15 of them had girls as the protagonists, while only 5 had boy protagonists, with one story being excluded from the list since that had dual protagonists with the male and female character having equal time in the spotlight. So, what happened over the years? Well, when I was a kid, I was very much aware that I could only write what I knew, and having a story with a guy at the helm was kind of an alien concept for me. At no point in my life would I ever consider myself feminine, but growing up I was definitely the kind of gal who was a huge sucker for any cute girly media and toys, so it was a simple matter of incorporating things I loved into my own creations. I want to be clear that I wasn't one of those kids who only liked girly stuff and was diametrically opposed to whatever was being offered to the boys club, since I loved me some shonen anime manga. It's just that they weren't guaranteed to win me over like anything that offered promises of pink rhinestones and stylish clothes. I grew out of these mindsets once I became a teenager, both in my taste in media and aesthetics, along with how I approached the character creation process, since my new source of inspiration was taking archetypes and tropes that I would see around me and trying to make my own version, which meant the boy-girl ratio in my OC Rolodex was becoming more balanced, but a shift began to occur where my male characters were getting the flavor blast treatment, while the ladies were in quarantine for catching the milquetoast virus. Though, I gotta give credit where it's due, and not underestimate the impact being part of a community had on me. When I was farting around on Microsoft Word back in grade school, coming up with stories was a solitary experience. But when I began making friends and entering the online art world in the late double aughts, I was able to share my characters with other people and see their own OCs, which had a huge influence on my writing. Other than me picking up a questionable habit of sneaking inside jokes and stories I intended to publish that originated in roleplays and group fanfictions, because most of my online friends were adolescent girls with raging hormones. Most of their OCs consisted of sexy men to take them by the hand, give them something to stand, and that's when I began. God, I put too much effort into this. Anyway, this pushed me in a direction where I prioritized creating and developing more male OCs out of an unconscious desire for social bonding, so I could pull up to the Skype clam bake and show my new characters to my lady friends and be all, "Look at me! I made a new boy! Simp for him!" So I think all of this created a perfect storm that resulted in the situation the Cage Genre World was in, especially since the first 5 members of the cast were all directly inspired by very specific characters from anime and manga that gave me the original idea to create the story to begin with. Still, the lack of development Sterbenfrau received in particular was especially damaging, since she was such an important character who was the catalyst behind Kleinod and Foppen's goals that would drive their actions throughout the fanime. And in Foppen's case, it didn't do a good job of establishing why he was so infatuated with Sterbenfrau, who, if you remember, was also the one responsible for killing him just so she could reap his soul and leaving him with debilitating pyrophobia, but he doesn't know that. Cruel irony. I don't know if I necessarily changed in this area between then and now, but the humor used in the 4 Coma stood out to me when I was rereading these pages. My sense of humor back then was very heavily indebted by comics I grew up reading a lot as a kid, which included Garfield, Dilbert, For Better or For Worse, Off the Mark, and even though they were no longer being serialized by the time I came around, Calvin and Hobbes and The Far Side. I can definitely see the parallels when I go back and flip through my old gag comics. They all had such a, I don't know, boomer-y vibe to them. Even the ones I drew in elementary school were like that, and it's really weird. It's been so long since I talked about this specific project of mine that I'm sure most people have forgotten about it by now, but this style of humor was the most jarring in Everyday Holiday, which was an all-ages 4 Coma I conceptualized back in 2017 about holiday ginjinkas, and yeah, it was a complete total mismatch. Finding a proper shade of red for her background took some time. I couldn't do a pure red because it would be too overpowering, but if I lightened it up too much it would turn pink, and I definitely didn't want that. Speaking of simps, Sterbenfrau's complete, so that means it's Foppen's time to shine. Fan favorite character amongst those following the series development, to be sure. I certainly had fun writing his banter between Weltraum and Kleinod, both inside and outside canon, but now I kind of wince a little when I think back to their dynamics, since it's basically just an edgy, angsty version of Mike, Sully, and Randall from Monsters, Inc. And ever since I made that realization, it's been tattooed into my hippocampus for all eternity. Funny story, one of the thumbnails I drew for Foppen and the Four Coma got left out of my reading. Not because it was embarrassing or contained redundant information about the Phantomix lore, it was entirely because I made a mistake while putting together the video. The sketch I'm referring to is in the top left-hand corner-ish of the canvas. It was originally a side panel for Foppen's human form that contained the short bio and facts I included for the rest of the main 5. There were a lot of questionable choices going on with this page, since the outfit I sketched for him in his human form is pretty much indistinguishable from his ghost design. And if you remember, the actual comic strip that was meant to show a glimpse of Foppen's human life was from when he was 4 years old, but that's neither here nor there. Obviously, I can't go back and change what I already posted on YouTube, but to redeem myself for making this oversight, for Foppen's part of this speed paint, I'm going to read the trivia I included for his human form, which is Andreas Papadiamandopoulos, partially colorblind, expert level dancer, obsessive and has an entitlement complex, has never had a girlfriend. So what I'm seeing here is, the whole plot of the main series could have been avoided if Foppen wasn't an incel. He wouldn't have to do all this stuff to antagonize Kleinod and Weltraum, since he wouldn't have a one-track fixation on becoming priest and gaining a human form, so he could impress and confess to Sterbenfrau in his dreams. While I'm here, I also have some panel excerpts to offer, never before seen to the public, that I had to cut out because they were part of the intro chapter and had world building information that I didn't want to repeat from my original video about the anniversary. In that chapter, there were 2 pages that went over the abilities belonging to each of the major characters from the Land of the Dead, and in the first panel of each strip I included a skill radar chart for each of the characters, so this is you guys' chance to see them. Here's Weltraum, Kleinod, Sterbenfrau, and lastly Foppen. Who would you pick to be on your D&D team just by looking at their specs? This subject has been very ghost-centric so far, but something that I didn't realize until now, and by now I mean as I'm typing this paragraph in a Word document after I've been editing this video for 3 days, is how the focus of the 4 Coma was very heavily bent towards the residents of the Land of the Dead, and the interactions they would have both in that realm and in the material world. But there wasn't even so much as a chapter about Kotori's Limbus realm, the beings that oversaw it, or the kinds of shenanigans Kleinod, Weltraum, and Kotori got into during their time there. Which is a real shame, since there could have been a lot of potential to see how these circumstances in Season 1 could have lent themselves to a more lighthearted strip. I can understand why I didn't take this opportunity though, since nothing in this series was definitively planned out. I think the only canon entry that I had a clear vision at the beginning, middle, and end for was Aki Squared. So back then it made more sense to just focus on all the characters interacting with each other while doing mundane things, and I already had the freedom to play fast and loose with the canon to allow certain characters to mingle when it would have been impossible for them to cross paths otherwise. Still, even by that logic, there's nothing preventing the prince and the princess of Kotori's Limbus realm from being involved in any meaningful capacity, and it even could have opened up to some fun dynamics with characters like Sterbenfrau, since one of her tasks as a priestess is to put ghosts in eternal sleep where they exist only inside their Limbus realm, or Sternenglanz, since the Limbus realm was part of the research she had on hand for his immortality project. Or shoot, even Kotori herself, since she's kind of not unconscious and having traumatic injuries to deal with. So the changes in her mental state from the original canon compared to this silly comic could allow her to have a different dynamic with these characters that primarily existed in her subconscious mind. Alas, a bad case of cerebral flatulence has blinded me to these possibilities, and these Season 1 exclusive villains weren't even a blip on my radar. I think most of this all boiled down to past me's inability to explore the potential of having a supernatural OC, doing interesting things outside of an ordinary human's ability, which is something I'm actively striving to pay attention to these days when world building the story projects I'm developing now, and it's a huge pet peeve of mine when I see an original species someone created, or a fictional biome inhabited by creatures of that species be virtually indistinguishable from reality. The only thing that's different is everyone has cat ears or mermaid tails for some reason. I suffered a lot trying to pose Foppen's legs in hand at this point of his drawing, but I tried to hide it. In the original thumbnail that I'm redrawing the hand for, he was holding his weapon, which is a TV trope certified one-handed Zweihander, which I didn't bother drawing here, but I briefly wanted his empty hand to retain that same closed shape. When that didn't work, I opted for an open claw hand instead, which turned out much better and still went with the flow of the rest of Foppen's pose while also being fitting for his character. I brought up Foppen's sword, so now I can't help but wonder if the rest of the ghosts have weapons of their own aside from Kleinod and Weltraum, or if I just didn't bother giving them any like I did for Sterbenfrau. Did I intend to give them weapons and just forgot about it, and what would they have been? Did Sternenglanz's tarot cards qualify as weapons? Did Sternenglanz use the weapon of the ghost whose existence he stole, or did his nature of him not being a real ghost prevent him from using one at all? Did Charlie Brown ever get to kick the football? Life is full of mysteries. Coloring Foppen is always fun, and his palette is surprisingly good. His outfit is all black with just accents of brown used for his shoes. Purple and yellow are opposites on the color wheel, so his hair and eyes complement each other and become the focal point of his design. I must confess that none of this was intentional when I first created him, so those choices I made for his appearance and color scheme were 100% random. Whether it was writing stories, developing characters, or drawing in general, I didn't make meticulous decisions for these things in the least, and went purely based on vibes, going wherever the current took me in the funky wonky little worlds in my brain. I was just lucky I was able to come up with such a pleasing color scheme for Foppen. Remember those elementary school era stories I tried to write that I brought up in Sterbenfrau's portion of the video? I chafed at the thought of planning my stories in advance because I convinced myself that this was cheating, so stream of consciousness all the way! Adult me is horrified by child me's recklessness. With that, Foppen is done and accounted for, so now it's time to move on to everyone's favorite MacGuffin on two legs.
Bird.
It's Kotori. We're trying Kotori next. As I said before, Kotori is the one character in this set who got to keep all her wardrobe changes from the original thumbnails, which was a change of pace I definitely appreciated. Figuring out the color schemes for each of her different outfits took some time though, as apart from her coat near the end of the Christmas play chapter and her suspender skirt ensemble off to the side, I didn't have any idea ahead of time of how they would look once they made it past the black and white stage of the Forcoma, so I had to make all these decisions on the spot. It feels weird to bring up at this point, but when I was writing the script for this voiceover, I didn't take into consideration any issues I would encounter with having what I said be synced to what was now playing on screen. So I'm talking a lot about coloring choices for Kotori while we're still in the sketching stage, and if I boost the speed on the sketching stage to make the audio and visuals match, the footage would be dizzyingly fast, so sorry about that. I don't want to keep bringing up my trials of editing this video because I feel like it'll just take up the whole narration if I'm not careful, but so far this process was the most chaotic in the history of my channel to date, just because of how often I would have to change things at the last minute by recording new audio post-mortem, rearranging the order of my voiceover in different sections, slamming an entire thermos of water every 5 minutes when my mouth would go dry after reading like 2 sentences off my script, and deleting huge parts of my voiceover that I already added to the video because writing scripts at 4 AM for too many days in a row was making me ramble like a psychopath. I don't know how well this video will be received because of how unstructured it is, but if you're enjoying this so far, then I respect you. I said at the beginning of this video that bringing back sketches from the Forcoma and redrawing them was pre-planned, and this is actually all thanks to Kotori. The spot illustration of her with this flashlight at the end of chapter 2 of the book was the one that I was always looking forward to finishing by virtue of having this character placed in a setting rather than just standing against the white of the page. There was going to be pretty lighting effects with the flashlight as the main source, a nighttime scene in a grassy field, which in all likelihood I would have just swiped in using a crappy default brush from Photoshop, set against a starry sky. And oh my gosh, I love making space-inspired backgrounds, it's so much fun, and the more I continue to work out pages for the Forcoma, the closer I would get to reaching that page, and I was so excited to color! Obviously, I couldn't bring back the full background for this composition, but I did step out of my comfort zone by indicating a strong light source and adding a darker overlay layer to help her feel more like she was in nighttime, which ended up being kind of necessary because there were so many parts of the illustration where Kotori's ponytails overlapped each other, and this really helped break up the steady stream of orange and prevented it from melding into each other in one big clump. Now, I was going to get Kotori a cutesy normal mug to drink her strawberry milk from, and you can see the exact moment where I suddenly decided to change it from that into, you know, that one BB Berg mug that has all Since Kotori is the only living human in the main cast, I wasn't sure if adding all the details to her eyes that the other characters lack would add a significant amount of time to the process, but it actually wasn't that bad. And more unintentional nostalgia was unlocked when I was working on her eyes for the top center image. I wanted to encapsulate that dreamy expression she had, so just for that one part of the collage, I changed the shape and position of the highlights along with adding some horizontal hatching to make them look more shoujo-y. And it reminded me so much of the way I used to draw eyes for my black and white illustrations back when I was a teenager that it kind of took me by surprise. When I would draw in this style of eyes digitally, back when Manga Studio Debut 4 was my daily driver, I had a time-saving hack for adding the line details that I thought was pretty clever, which was to fill in an arc of solid black underneath the highlights in the top half of the eye. Then rather than hand drawing the curved horizontal lines underneath and the lines around the rim of the eye, I would just use the speed line and conscientious burst filters to do the job. The context behind this specific thumbnail kind of cracks me up since it was originally from the beach episode. It basically showed Weltraum, Morgen, and Kotori staring dreamily at Schutze from off in the distance. Weltraum and Morgen are filled with nothing but thirsty and corrupt fantasies about him, and meanwhile Kotori is just thinking about if Schutze is able to see with his skin like an octopus since he lost his eyes after becoming a ghost. I did bring back Morgan's thumbnail from the same strip, which you might be able to pick out just by looking at the collage once we get to her part in the video, but I can't even bring myself to look at Weltraum's panel, and if I don't want to see it, then you're never gonna see it either. I'm sorry for bullying Weltraum so much throughout these videos. He just gives me excruciating secondhand embarrassment sometimes. It's okay, I'm done now, I promise. At first I was really happy with Kotori's hair once I finished her collage, but now the more I look at it, the more I dislike it, and it all boils down to the physics of her ponytails. The way I drew them doesn't make any sense at all. They're just an inconsistent mess. I need to move on to something else now because this is really getting me down. We were just talking about Morgan earlier, so let's move on to her part of the speed paint next. Holy Moses, we're halfway through the cast and there's still so much of the speed paint left to go. I don't know what I was thinking when I was first putting together this video because originally I was just going to insert all of my raw footage captured from Procreate as is for the final time-lapse without trimming or speeding it up at all because my logic was that it was my dumb idea to go over so many thumbnails for each collage and now I was going to make it everyone else's problem so my suffering wouldn't be in vain. But once I finally put all the footage together, my desperate desire to not have my computer burst into flames went out in the end because I was so hoping to not have this be my third video in a row that would be over an hour long. Oh well, at least it's shorter than my Kapi Yamaguchi fan art tribute. But I'll tell you what, if I was still using the editing software I had before I switched over to CapCut, there's no way I get this video done in any reasonable amount of time. The first program I ever used that wasn't a variation of Windows Movie Maker was Vegas Movie Studio HD Platinum 10.0, which definitely served its purpose at the time, but it's so old that it became harder and harder to work with as the years went on. Which is kind of sad because when I first got it as a kid, I thought it was the coolest thing ever and I felt so powerful using this to create all my videos. I can't quit using it completely as I still have some work in progress project files for videos I'm going to upload to the channel but can't finish because, you know where this is going. They're still trapped in my old computer and I haven't been able to get them off that hard drive yet. The day I'm finally able to move everything onto my current computer for good will be a joyous one indeed, both in having access to stuff I saved and created that I haven't seen in years, as well as being able to finish these old videos so I can migrate to CapCut as my editing software of choice permanently. Immediately after I say that though, I remember that DaVinci Resolve is a program that exists, and yeah, I definitely do want to get my hands on it because I'm not sure CapCut will be able to hold a candle to it. I'm just not able to right now because the learning curve for getting used to this software is really steep, at least for me. Plus I'm running dangerously low on space for my CD drive. This is actually one of the reasons why I ended up doing all of my art for this video on Procreate, because I wanted to get as much done off my computer as possible so it wouldn't be bloated even more with backups during the drawing and editing process for this speed paint. Ironically, it was around the time that I started working on Schutze's piece that I got notifications saying my iPad was out of storage. Can you believe all the digital art I've been making since 2020 was drawn on a first-gen 9x7-inch iPad Pro with only 32 gigs of storage? It was the cheapest one I could find on eBay, okay? Go easy on me. Not gonna lie, I was terrified that I would be running out of memory on CapCut before I even got halfway through editing the speed paint, since that was a problem I kept running into with my last 2 videos. But so far everything has been smooth sailing and I haven't gotten a single error message on my PC yet. Hallelujah. How about we go back to what it is I'm actually drawing? I wasn't sure how to approach Morgan's outfit and color since I only had like 2 rough color comps for her I ever made, and one of them featured her in a design that quickly became obsolete, so I kind of had to just wing it. One of those original colored sketches had her jacket vest thingy, sorry I'm not good with fashion, as black, which I hated even at the time since combined with her long white hair made her design feel too dull, but I guess I was too stubborn to change it, and the task of making this very monochromatic color scheme work was a problem for future me to solve once it came time to draw finished art of her. That time never came in the Cage on the Wall's lifetime, so now that future me is drawing her for this video, I refuse to keep using the black color. I couldn't stand it anymore! Brown is the common color for the ghost shoes, so that's what I changed her top to. I know her design contained a short pleated skirt and boots, but I wasn't vibing with them, so I removed and adjusted them respectively. I sort of regret doing this since it means this artwork of Morgan isn't faithful to how she looked in canon, which is kind of a mistake. But then again, I had no qualms about retroactively tampering with Kleinod's design for this anniversary, so Hakuna Matata. Filling in the rims of her glasses was when I knew I was really committing myself to the task of rendering all this artwork on one layer, since I also added that red color directly on top of her sketch once I changed it from purple. Of course, I knew going into this that one layer rendering would be faster than tracing over my sketch with line art, but I still wasn't sure about going into the unknown like this, so I was putting a lot of confidence in this method before I had even tried it. And yes, as you already saw, I was extremely indecisive about the orientation of thumbnails for this specific collage and kept changing it up. I think it looks more balanced now, don't you? I wasn't too sure about how things would go down once it came time for me to start rendering Morgan's hair, since this texture isn't something I'm used to drawing, and fortunately it ended up not taking too long and it was pretty relaxing. Plus her hair is so light that I didn't have to add any highlights to it, so that was a bonus. I changed things up a little on one of her chibi illustrations since the sketch depicted her with a hot plate, while in this updated version I replaced it with a dirty magazine.
Why is it spicy?
Because for some reason one of Morgan's defining characteristics for her type was that she was in the market for such things. Nice! Morgan is present and accounted for. Let's go see what her little sister's up to. So, once we start getting past Weltraum, Kleinod, Sterbenfrau, Foppen, and Kotori, I reach a part where I start asking myself, okay, Elle, what were you trying to accomplish when you were making these OCs? This section of the cast is just some no man's land where I was arbitrarily shoving new characters into the story just for the sake of padding out the ensemble, and I would try to reverse engineer some kind of role they could have in the plot. At the time that I was still actively working on the Caged Underworld, I was in a really dark place creatively where I didn't have any confidence in my story being able to have any kind of lasting impact compared to other writers I knew. I had a lot of insecurity about my story being too shallow, and creating a bunch of new OCs for this role was just one of my strategies to try to counteract these feelings and make this story feel less, plain. But predictably, this didn't work out in the long run since basically none of these characters ended up serving a meaningful purpose in the story as a whole, so their existence just felt contrived. Technically, out of all the Season 2 exclusive characters, Nacht was the only one that did fulfill a greater purpose, and it was for all the wrong reasons, since it was more in a meta sense rather than a benefit for the narrative. First of all, her design was basically a recycle of an OC that I had previously scrapped, which is why her outfit looks so different compared to the rest of the ghosts. I think she was a villain of the week originally that was either for the Caged Underworld itself or another story I was working on. I don't remember at this point, and I don't have enough time to try and find which one of my sketchbooks had the first drawing I ever did of her. But literally, Nacht's only reason for existing in her current form was as an event character. Without going into all the ugly details, she was based off a real person that I knew, and oh my god, I could write a book as long as Strong's Exhaustive Concordance about just how maddening it was to interact with this person, and it would still only be the first volume. Let's just say there was a lot of doubt as to whether they were really good at rage baiting or if they were just that oblivious to how social interaction worked. So even though Nacht didn't have a whole lot of screen time in the 4 coma, which is you guys' only favorite reference for her, the material I was creating for the Cage Auto World, that was pretty much the direction I was taking her in because this person was driving me crazy and I needed some kind of passive-aggressive outlet for all my frustration. Looking back at this footage, I really wish I had looked up some references for suspenders because the way I drew them here looks really sloppy and weird, but you know, when you've been having insomnia for 17 months straight and are trying to combat overwhelming time anxiety, it becomes remarkably easy to default to the path of least resistance. By the time I got to flattening Nox layers and cleaning her up for rendering, I was definitely open to finding new ways to get through this process more quickly, and one idea that occurred to me was to lasso tool around any stray lines and just deleting or color dropping my selections accordingly. Spoiler alert, it didn't work! To be fair, Procreate's color fill feature is the weakest tool in the app, and the reference layer option has always been kind of weird and confusing, so I'm sure if I was using a different program I would have gotten a better result. Fortunately, since her hat is covering up most of her hair, I was able to save a lot of time that I would have spent shading and highlighting, and she got done the quickest out of the group, at least according to the time-lapse that came out of her at the end. Which is ironic because I spent way too long actually getting this done. It felt like I was doing a million other things instead of actually drawing. At this point I was starting to run out of steam since I missed my original deadline of when I wanted to have this video done and uploaded, which was either the last Saturday of May or the day afterward at the latest, so that was kind of demotivating. Where my mind was, I thought that since I would be drawing 12 pictures with this speed paint, it would be relatively easy for me to get them done, so what the heck was taking so long? It took a while for it to dawn on me that while making pieces of art with simple rendering and backgrounds wasn't anything too crazy on its own, the fact that each of those 12 pieces was a collage containing 10 variations of the same character made the process a lot more complicated. So once I finally did the math, I realized that expecting myself to create 120 unique drawings in less than a month for a video I would then have to write a script for, edit, and upload was maybe an unwise decision. To that effect, this video has gone on for too long without me acknowledging how quiet I've been on YouTube lately. After posting relatively frequently in 2023, I disappeared after posting my anniversary video on October 10th, came back for a hot minute late February to upload my 4 coma video, and then disappeared again until now. So I should explain how I allowed this to happen. I don't want to get too personal, but long story short, after cramming to get everything for the anniversary video done on time, I needed to rest after completing such a big project. Not just recording and editing the main video itself, but also drawing everyone for the countdown speed paints too. However, that kind of break wasn't going to happen anytime soon, because after getting my video for TC's anniversary done and uploaded, I immediately needed to turn my attention to like 3 other commitments I also had to finish in a set time frame, and it required a lot of effort on my end to complete. Rushing it and cutting corners just to get it done was not an option. I thought I could carry my momentum from completing this one task to the others that required my attention, but my growing fatigue, along with real-life pressures, both internal and external, ended up putting me out of commission, although I did temporarily bounce back after setting a goal for myself to get something uploaded on Leap Day, then collapsed again until I was finally able to start turning things around for good sometime in April. I do have a big surprise I'm working on, and if all goes well, you'll be seeing a lot more videos from me for the rest of this month, so stay tuned. Alright, we're back to drawing the dudes, and now it's Ratten's turn to step up to the plate. Honestly, putting together thumbnails for his piece came together a little too easily. He's the only one other than Weltraum to have a collage made entirely of sketches that I didn't show in my previous video, which probably says a lot about who they are as characters. An underrated detail about Ratten that never occurred to me until I started working on his artwork for this video is that he's the only character who personally knew a fellow ghost that landed the dead before their deaths, which would be Morgen and Nacht. One could make a case for Morgen and Nacht themselves belonging in this category, as well as Donner and Schnee, but I don't think it really counts since they're biologically related to each other, with Morgen and Nacht being twins and Donner and Schnee being cousins, so Ratten stands alone as someone who already knew someone in the group in their human lives that he didn't already have a familial bond with. Which definitely opens up a lot of unexplored potential for the kind of dynamic he could have had with the vast majority of the cast who were only able to meet after becoming ghosts, and it even could have given him a unique perspective on Weltraum's situation with Kotori and how to approach it. I don't know if Ratten will come back in the revamp, but I'm so sad that I've been sitting on this idea all this time without even knowing it, that finding ways that these ideas could be developed as a compelling enough reason for reviving him. I feel bad for going on and on about revamp this, revamp that throughout the video, but never going into detail about this future version of the story or how much it's changed in the K-genre world. And that's just because it's still in such an early stage of rough development that I can't confidently talk about it since that information could change at any moment. When I first brought up my plans for the comic reboot in my original hour-and-a-half-long retrospective video, I only talked about changes to the story for a whopping 57 seconds and was being purposefully vague, and already some of those tidbits I shared have become obsolete. So you can probably understand why I'm reluctant to talk about it right now. It's really guilt-inducing for me to up-talk myself as a writer when I have no publicly available stories to show for it, so please be patient with me. Because of how skinny he is and the amount of sharp angles there are with his hair and bandana, I wanted to pay attention to the structure of his face by having it follow the same shape language, so I drew it as a triangle instead of starting with a circle to indicate the skull like I normally do. Basically trying to apply the lessons I learned while drawing Shinichikudo for my Kapayamaguchi tribute into my original art. His spiky hair was definitely out of my comfort zone to draw since I really don't draw hairstyles like that at all, and my style naturally has a lot of soft round curves to it, so that made it even more of a challenge. I basically gaslit myself into thinking that I was drawing a 90s shonen anime protagonist so I could get in the right mindset, all the while making sure to have my lines be as straight as possible, and I think I got the look I was going for. He's like Cruncher from A Tale of Two Cities, his hair is sharp enough to tear up his bedsheets. Another unique quality Ratten had was that he was the only character outside of the main five who had a confirmed voice actor. I have a very vague gut feeling that maybe Schnee did as well, but I can't say for sure. However, I do know for a fact that Ratten had a voice actor, that's beyond doubt. You see, my mom has an internet friend from Australia, and I asked if she knew anyone who could voice Ratten, and my mom's friend's brother was able and willing to do so. It always made me laugh, even back then, because the two of them have completely opposite personalities. Ratten's voice actor is this super caring, big-hearted guy who works at a suicide hotline and just wants to help others, and Ratten himself is just the biggest chaotic neutral goblin man-child on the face, body, and butthole of the earth. Also, we're not going to talk about how long it took me to draw his face and profile in the top left-hand corner, and after all that struggling, I still hate how it turned out. Fun fact about Ratten, his bandana was actually inspired by another fanime character, which was Trey from Gospel Holy Relic of Church by Tenchi Miharu. It's such a minor detail, but the thought of a character who's literally the Antichrist having any creative influence on this polydactyl podhead is breaking my brain, and I had to bring it up somewhere. I'd like to point out that as I was posting all this artwork for this speed paint across my social media, you can find all the links in the description of this video and all my other publicly available videos on my channel. When I uploaded them to Blue Sky, Rattens ended up performing the best from the entire set. I'm confused and slightly alarmed. Immediately after flattening his layers, I had to go back to the individual flat color layer I still had saved and hidden so I could adjust the brightness of his eyes and sclera. I thought I could get used to how they looked, but the colors were so overpowering and I couldn't take it anymore. As you can see, I decided at the last minute to change his ice cream flavor from mint chocolate chip to Neapolitan, partly because there was already a lot of green in this image and I wanted to break up the colors, but mostly because each flavor contained all of Morgan's colors and I thought it would be a cute subtle nod to his puppy love crush on her. Although arguably not fixed the Neapolitan color scheme way better, but shh. Ooh, rendering his hair was fun. So to help establish its spiky texture, I went with solid lines for the highlights rather than my usual vertical hatching. And for some reason, the brightness and shape of the highlights combined with the overlay layer I'd already airbrushed onto his bangs ended up giving his hair a Frutiger Arrow vibe for some reason. For context, I was listening to Takeshi Yabo the whole time I was rendering this piece, and maybe just hearing Lise in the background was putting me in that kind of headspace while working on the hair, since when I look at the final piece without having any music playing, it isn't giving me that same feeling I was having before, so maybe Spotify was tricking my brain into perceiving something that wasn't there. But either way, I really love how his hair turned out. It looks so classy. Ratten doesn't deserve to have such nice hair. Let's move on to the next character as quickly as possible because I think I'm starting to lose my mind. Alright, we're on to Schutze now, aka the only sane character in all of the caged underworld. Gosh, finding sketches of it to finish for this video was a struggle. Half because he was the character who made the least amount of appearances in the 4 coma, and half because he has the emotional range of a slice of bread. I didn't draw him very often back in the day, even though he was kind of a big plot point in season 2. Just because I was so intimidated by his body type, and for the life of me, I just couldn't get it to look good when I would try to draw him. Recently, I've come to discover that drawing muscles is actually a lot of fun, and I enjoy it every time I do it. That sounded wrong. But I haven't gotten to a point where I've drawn buff characters often enough to be able to draw them from memory, so I had to look up a bunch of references to get Schutze looking right. Which in hindsight, I probably should have done it in incognito mode. It was really good practice though, and I had a lot of fun doing it. It's just one of those artist things where you want to draw part of the body and have it look good, but not so good that everyone who sees it assumes you're a freak, you know? This is kind of a tangent, but I think given my secret agenda to propagate an image of me being a Hifumi Yamada apologist, you'd be forgiven for assuming that he's my favorite Danganronpa character, but that title actually belongs to Gonta! The sad thing is that I still have yet to draw Gonta some proper fan art to this day, and it gives me an even greater incentive to practice drawing muscles so I can do justice to my beloved entomologist cinnamon roll baked with extra protein powder because he is so precious and I just want the best for him. Anyway, why do I always choose the less popular characters as my blorbos? The funniest thing about Schutze is that he's the most beefy and masculine character in the whole series, and yet the whole time I was working on him, I was playing videos in the background that can only be described as super girly and kidcore. In case you're wondering, yes, I do have stuff I listen to while I draw, and no, I give almost no consideration to whether or not it fits what it is I'm working on. So my first video for the anniversary where I did a deep dive on the plot of the entire series, there was one pretty significant detail about Schutze that I kinda left out, and it contains some spoilers for the season 2 finale, so proceed with caution if you haven't watched the video yet, but basically he's chosen to be Kleinod and Weltraum's witness once they become Purgatori's new co-priest, and he ends up being the one who physically puts Foppen into eternal sleep as Foppen's penalty for killing Kotori. I actually was aware of this tidbit when I was putting together the video, but I left it out on purpose because it was still a rough idea that I was still in the process of test driving, so I was torn on whether or not it was relevant to bring up when I was talking about other parts of the story's canon that I was more sure of. Like, in that same scene, Foppen also regains his human form as well, implying that he inexplicably was chosen as a witness as well, but then immediately after getting his human form back when Weltraum and Kleinod become priests, he has to face his life sentence, so it doesn't make any sense. But that's the idea I was working with at the time, so honestly, nothing about Schutze's existence makes sense anyway, so what's one more extra plot hole? Okay, so trying to keep the stripe pattern on Nacht's ribbon looking even during the cleanup stage was not fun, and now cleaning up the pinstripe pattern on Schutze's suit was 10 times worse! I don't think I was as eager to finish any piece for this video as I was Schutze's. Yeah, his body was fun to draw and all, but everything else was a pain. Our strong silent swole side character is done! Praise the Lord. I already made this joke on Discord, but he's the first in a subsection of the story's cast that I've affectionately nicknamed the 4 horsemen of characters who deserve to be written better, which means it's time to start drawing the next character in this section, Donner. Oh, by the way, if you've been keeping up with my previous videos for the Cage Underworld's anniversary, do you have a favorite character? For me, obviously, Kleinod is very near and dear to my heart, but while I was editing the 4 Coma video, I ended up gaining a soft spot for Donner. The dynamic he has with Schutze is so silly, and it makes me wish they could have interacted in something a little more canonically sound than a gag comic spin-off. Funnily enough, despite all these characters being my own creation, I actually did have a least favorite, which was a tie between Sterbenfrau and, believe it or not, Weltraum. I promise this wasn't part of some weird Chloe from Miraculous Ladybug kind of agenda, although in Sterbenfrau's case, it started that way when I first conceptualized her at the time that I first came up with the idea for the story, but it mostly boiled down to me being aware that there were underdeveloped characters with weak personalities and getting frustrated with them by proxy because I didn't know how to fix these problems. This was back when I was still in my throw character traits at the wall and see what sticks era, because at the time I had no concept of developing a character based on what purpose they would be serving in the narrative as a whole, which is a habit I only started breaking in, gosh, I think as late as 2021. Yikes! I understand that all of this sounds like I'm completely adept at understanding the basic tenets of writing and that I should have chosen something else to dedicate my life to, which is valid, but sometimes you're born with only a sample of the manual for unspoken rules of critical thinking and common sense, and you can't obtain the full version non-neuro-spicy people have by default without you having to pay for extra DLC. What the heck is this analogy? Is this what sucks about learning art and writing alone? You have nobody to help you grow when you're doing something wrong, and you're just getting more and more used to repeating your same mistakes because you don't know any better? Well, at least I'm learning about these things now. Way later than any reasonable person should have, but it's better than not learning at all, right? I'm becoming more and more self-aware of just how little I know about art and storytelling, and it's incredibly daunting to realize everything I need to do in order to create good things. Although, that's something I've heard basically every artist say is the mindset you always want to be in. You want to feel like you're in over your head, because if you're too comfortable, you won't be in an environment that allows you to grow. I guess I'm just not used to how much being in that mindset would shake me up, because that's yet another thing I'm learning way too late in life. Even though more than half of the thumbnails I used for Donner's collage that have already been shown in my previous video, it kind of felt like I was drawing him from scratch, since I would be updating my initial sketches by giving him that hairdo that Mike Score from A Flock of Seagulls could only dream of, which is definitely an improvement over this super basic anime boy haircut he had before, and whatever this horrible mullet was from these really old sketches of the comic.
Oh god, what is that?
Why do I not remember this design at all? Was this a traumatic memory that I had suppressed or something? Holy crap. I always like this sketch I used for the top corner of Donner's piece where he's wrapping up the Christmas play before everyone goes to eat their food, so I wanted to bring it back here. But since that original scene had him taking off Noctur's hat, I wanted to remove it and give him another pose that made slightly more sense. But despite everything else remaining generally the same, it had a side effect that gave me the updated version a different emotional feeling. What was once Donner just removing his director's hat after micromanaging this chaotic rendition of A Christmas Carol ended up looking more like he's trying to charm his way out of a situation where he got caught doing something he shouldn't while trying not to crack. This is embarrassing. It was only when I started working on Donner's sketches that I realized for the first time that I didn't correctly design his outfit. So in the story, ghosts that had happened to land of the dead always have a bespoke outfit, regardless of what they were wearing when they first died, which usually sticks to a standard black and white color scheme with accents of brown, unless your name is Nacht. And if they regain their human forms, they get a completely different outfit that's a lot more ornate. Donner served as Sterbenfrau's witness when she became priestess, so the majority of his screen time is spent in his human form, but I designed him as if he was still wearing his ghost uniform. Oops! I guess that shows how much of an afterthought this design about Donner's status was for me if I didn't even bother to design a proper upgrade outfit for him. I continued to make this mistake by even tagging the art I posted for his piece on social media as Ghost OC, and by the time I realized it, it was too late for me to go back and change it. C'est la vie. The coloring process for Donner in general was kind of confusing because he's one of the few characters to have both a natural eye and hair color, so if it wasn't for the fact that his eyes are completely flat with no highlights in them, he doesn't have any qualities that would set him apart from normal human. At least the blonde of the hair and the blue of the background ended up looking really nice together. Whenever I'm looking at all this artwork as a set, I find myself pulling up Donner more than the others because the colors are just so pleasing. For some reason it kind of reminds me of the front cover of Go For It Nakamura. On another note about Donner's palette, even though I was eye-dropping directly from some rough color comps I did at the time that I redesigned him, I was a little iffy on the shade I chose for his skin during the flat stage since I thought it might look too dull and sickly. But once I brought in some pink to do the shade, it helped breathe so much life into him. I was really taken aback by how much of a difference it made. One thing that bothered me was working on this figure near the bottom left-hand corner. I couldn't put my finger on it, but once it came time to start the writing process, it dawned on me that I accidentally turned Donner into Lucas from Mother 3. And that's it for Lucas. Donner. Our 11th character in this speed paint is Schnee, which is funny because her piece was actually the second one that I finished right after I completed Weltraum's. The reason why I went out of order with her specifically is because her sketches were the most clean out of the whole set right from the start, and she was a much needed break after all the time I spent tightening up Weltraum's piece. Poor Schnee is the only character in the cast that, up to this point, I'd never made any artwork for that was either polished or colored, so I had to settle on a lot of costume details and visualize my mental images of what her color scheme looked like right on the spot. Shoot, I didn't even think about what subspecies of ghost she would be before I settled on her being the same type as Foppen. There was no consideration behind this decision whatsoever, other than making sure all the ghost types were decently balanced, since most of the categories already had 2 ghosts from the primary ensemble occupying them, and I really didn't want to go above that. Foppen and Nacht were the only solo ones at the time, and for some reason I liked the idea of Schnee being a loose-headed ghost over a rear-footed ghost, even though I pretty much never drew her with the same pointed ears and teeth Foppen had that were supposed to be common features of that ghost type. A little piece of trivia, in really early drafts of the story there was another subspecies of ghosts that were green and based off of Kuchisakeona, slitmouth ghosts. But just like how Toei treats their green precures, I ended up trashing this idea pretty quickly. Back to Schnee, the dress I designed for her in the 4 combo was basically just a placeholder silhouette kind of design, but it was so unspeakably basic that I felt like she could at least be blessed with a capelet shawl so she wouldn't look so boring. This is kind of a random spoiler from way early on in development for Season 2's finale that I ended up scrapping, but Kotori actually did end up becoming a ghost who inhabited the land of the dead after Kleinod and Weltraum become co-priests, as opposed to Foppen completely snuffing out her soul like what happened in subsequent rewrites, and the dress I drew Schnee in here was loosely inspired by the dress I gave Kotori's form. I don't know, I just thought it looked cute and I really wanted to bring it back. Kinda similar to what I talked about earlier with Schutze, but there was another plot point involving Schnee and Donner by loose association that I left out on purpose when I was talking about the Secret Trio backstory movie, which is that she actually did find out about Sterbenfrau killing other humans just so she could immediately reap their souls afterwards and game the system so she could become priestess quicker. This happened right before Sterbenfrau did what she did to Makoto. However, Sterbenfrau already knew that Schnee knew, and in retaliation chose to have only Donner stand as her witness, so while he would be getting a physical body along with Sterbenfrau, Sterbenfrau's rejection of Schnee meant that she would be sent to the afterlife once Sterbenfrau assumed her role as priestess, and her knowledge of Sterbenfrau's secret would be taken away with her before anyone else could find out what she had done. Slowly, Donner would end up discovering on his own the crime Sterbenfrau committed to get to where she is now, and the true meaning of her not taking Schnee to be her witness, and it was one of the main reasons why he ended his time as Kleinod's mentor and wasn't seen much around the land of the dead after that. Again, this was a very rough concept, and for that reason I omitted it from the movie's description. After I finished her picture, I was taken aback by how pretty she ended up looking, especially with how shiny and vibrant her hair turned out. Weltraum's hair doesn't have any highlights in it, so being able to include them for the first time in this process with her really opened my eyes to how much they pulled in the colors. It was worth all the struggling I faced trying to keep her from looking like Seda from Mermaid Melody, and I was absolutely obsessed with the way her hair looked, at least until Ratten came around. And yeah, I don't really have anything else to say other than Schnee is super cute, and I adore how her piece turned out. Finally, we have reached the very last character we'll be drawing for this long video, which is, of course, Sternenglanz. If I'm being brutally honest, I think the selection of thumbnails I chose for his piece is the worst of all the characters in this video, as I feel like very few of them do an adequate job of showing off aspects of his character design. Specifically his odd-color eyes that you only get to see in 2 little chibis of him off to the side. Now that I think about it, I wonder if that feature was too much of a spoiler about him technically not being a ghost, since if he really did die and become assigned to the same subspecies of ghost that Sterbenfrau belonged to, as the audience is led to assume, that both of his eyes would just be red. Then again, Schutze had to come along and ruin everything just by him existing, so who even knows at this point? Only slightly related, but since Morgen and Schutze are the same subspecies of ghost, and both of them have unique eye features compared to the rest of the cast, with Schutze lacking eyes completely, and Morgen having half-hooded eyes combined with her wearing glasses that she otherwise wouldn't have needed when she was alive, I decided to retroactively make this indicative of qualities a human would have in order to become this kind of ghost. Like they had a myopic worldview or something like that. However, Sternenglanz is the only other character with half-hooded eyes too, so you can see how there could be some mixed signals going on here. Obviously, this has nothing to do with any ghostly nature he may or may not have, and his eye shape was just a result of me feeling inspired to start drawing my characters with different facial features and structures so I could hopefully unlearn my same face syndrome bad habits. Baby steps. There was an interesting continuity thing I noticed when I was going through these 4 combo thumbnails. It occurred to me first when I saw some sketches of Donner, but this one rough draft of Sternenglanz that I rescued for this video made me even more aware of it. And that's the fact that both of them are seen writing with their left hand. I'd say it's about continuity because I know for a fact that Weltraum was the only character I specifically paid attention to having him be left-handed. And even in the context of the Christmas Play chapter of the Coma, you can see Donner also using his right hand, so I guess that means he's ambidextrous, but for the specific images I chose for both his and Sternenglanz's collages, they're pretty much exclusively using their left hand, so that's something I wasn't very careful about for sure. Even though this was unintentional on my part, I figured that if Sternenglanz did in theory prefer using his left hand to write, then I could cheat with the original sketch a little by replacing the book he was holding with a legal pad, since anything top-out will realistically be more comfortable to use. His white glove is gonna get all smudged up with graphite though. Speaking of cheating with my thumbnails, the one in the top right hand corner I essentially redrew into a completely different picture, just because the original version was so situational and adapting it faithfully for this collage wouldn't make any sense. In the context of this strip this was a panel for, Sternenglanz was holding Nacht's hat, so I removed it. Why is Nacht's hat the common denominator in these situations? But now that he had nothing he was interfacing with anymore, I wanted him to be doing something with his hands in the position he was already in, and my solution was to reimagine his pose into something more in line with the moment that could have occurred in the latter half of TCU's second backstory movie. Even though Sternenglanz already has his trademark bedhead, I wanted to make his hair look more unkempt to accentuate his emotions, but after doing so, I think he ended up unintentionally looking like Randall from Ranfriend, and I don't know how to feel about that. If I had a nickel for every time I brought up a fictional character named Randall in this video, I'd have 2 nickels. Gosh, turning a Kleinod fan child concept into a canon part of the cast was such a silly idea. Obviously, if Sternenglanz really was Kleinod and Weltraum's son, he would have fluffy hair. Every time I look at content I made with Sternenglanz back in the day, it saddens me deeply. In my head, he was such a cool character and intimidating villain, but the way he actually turned out in the movies was a totally different story. Which is why I've dedicated myself to reviving Sternenglanz in the future and writing him with the proper arc and development that he needed. You have my word. I won't let him burn out like this! To be fair, if it wasn't for the fact that the K-genre world started undergoing some pretty major shakeups later in its lifespan before the Most Talented Ghost Towns canon began to take over, then I probably would have had more time to think about and fix these issues I brought up earlier. It might be fun to do a script doctor version of the original draft and see what potential it had, but it's not really a priority for me, and I'm fine letting the K-genre world stay as a time capsule, preserved the way it is, even with all its flaws. Even though the process of drawing Sternenglanz's collage from start to finish wasn't necessarily faster than the others shown before, the cleanup process for turning the sketches into line art was on the easier side, since I found out pretty quickly from rendering the other pieces that the stray marks and blurred parts of my sketches were less visible against darker colors, so I could be less precise when filling up Sternenglanz's artwork and it wouldn't look too sloppy, although I noticed that the line edges that were in contact with his hair did look pretty deep fried since I had to adjust the HSB a lot. I hate how nowadays whenever I draw or look at old art of Sternenglanz, all I can think of is that what text post meme putting out how lab coats are a kind of lingerie. On that note, Sternenglanz's piece is complete, which means we've reached the end of this very, very long draw and talk video. If you've been watching along all the way up to this point, then you truly are a friend of the channel, and I appreciate you so much for choosing to hang out with me for all this time. Here's a slice of cake as a reward for your perseverance. You deserve it. So here's all the art that I drew for this video next to the sketches they were based off of, and I think they cleaned up very well. My teenage self is very satisfied with what I was able to create. Once again, a huge thank you for staying through this entire video, as well as for being so patient with me when it's taken me so long to get back to posting new art online. I really want to make up for lost time by making as many videos as I can for the rest of this month, so look forward to that. Until next time, bye!